Have you ever tried mixing mediums in Rebelle and expected to make beautiful art, but instead you just ended up feeling overwhelmed and watched muddy paint splashes dry on your digital canvas? Well, you aren't alone. Even worse is when you look for help and people just say, make it expressive, or use pencil, watercolor, and then oil last, which is good advice, but it's not great advice. Well, what people aren't telling you is that what you need is a repeatable process that brings out the best of each medium, gives you clarity, and helps you make better art. And this framework I'm about to teach you won't leave you saying, that was a cool video, but how do I actually do it? So the framework I'm getting, actually no, we aren't starting there. We're gonna dive straight into creating. So right here, what you see me doing is creating compositional plans. The truth is that there's multiple things that were wrong with the previous paintings that I just showed you. And there's probably multiple things that are wrong with the paintings that you're making. So composition is the key to everything. But I'm not just going to talk about some abstract idea of composition. Right now, we're just going to use the basic kind of compositional plans, which are horizontal, diagonal, across kind of shape, circular or radial, and basic vertical compositions. These kinds of things. Then quickly, we're going to get our poses defined and get what we like done. And from there, we're going to select which one of these ideas we like the most, and we're going to start drawing. Now, one thing that I have to get into before we proceed is the actual power that your pencil has when you're drawing. You don't just want to draw a figure and have all of your lines being even or equally sized or dark. If you take a look at these drawings, there's a slight difference. If you look closely, one of them has an eye that's darker than the rest of the illustration, so it actually creates a center of interest even at the drawing stage. And it's because not all of these parts have been treated equally. I've taught this multiple times that you need to pick out a center of interest. You have to choose where you're going to have more detail and where you're going to have some rest. You have to play the contrast game, and that applies to the drawing stages of your paintings and the painting stages or whatever stage you're in. And let me prove how important having this visual rest is to you. If you look at this painting here, there's tons going on. There's muddy colors, there's way too much texture everywhere, there's no focal point, and everything has detail, everything has tons of texture. Now, if you look at what I do here, where I start to simplify, we already have good contrast going, we already have areas of rest and areas of more detail, and we know our eyes kind of want to start going. And then on top of that, we add on this, which is better color. Now you can see that inside this painting, there are so many things that needed to be done. What more the messy watercolor oil paintings that have bad proportions and other things? There's multiple stages, like I said, where things are going to go wrong. So you need to understand how to execute each stage well before you end up with a mess that you just can't solve. So let's continue getting into it with another example right here, which is a bit more like watercolor-ish. We have this painting I did, and I took an expressive approach. That same expressive approach that everybody talks about. And everywhere is messy, and that's to be expected. Maybe this is what your paintings look like right now too. What I wanted to do was create this interesting mohawk crown kind of effect that was supposed to be a huge attention point, but it's competing with all of these lines and splashes everywhere, so you can barely see it. So what I do is that I start to erase some bits, and the crown starts to become clearer. The focal point becomes much, much more clear by getting rid of unnecessary noise. So even when you're being expressive, you kind of have to trust an instinct that you built from studying first to allow you to then express within bounds where it's going to work. Like if you're a freestyle dancer, you can't just freestyle dance and do a head spin if you've never even practiced a head spin meticulously. However, if you got your training in, you were doing your head spins, and then eventually you said, okay, now I'm going to try and improvise. Maybe you're dancing, you do a little thing with your feet, and then you jump right into a head spin. You can do it because you've trained your head spins, and you can do it intuitively because it's become second nature from how much you've practiced. And that's the same problem that you run into when somebody tells you, just be expressive. It's not going to work that way. You need to get and dial in your understanding before you can let your intuition lead you into making correct choices instinctively. Alright, so back to the pencil sketch. Let's not get too carried away here. So earlier on, you heard me say that pencil on top of oil and all of that isn't the best piece of advice. But one thing I've found is that when I do start with pencil, I'm able to predetermine the amount of detail that I can get in my drawings. So as you see inside these sketches that I did, by having the planes of the eyelid already predefined, it helped me think in that level of detail when I started painting. And you can see with this other painting that I did, it wasn't pencil, but it was an underpainting in thinned oils. The amount of detail that I put in the underpainting pretty much was echoed through the entire painting once I started applying the paint. You can see how the eyelashes were defined. The other areas were also defined similarly to the underpainting. And it's because from the beginning, I had my mind set out on the amount of detail that I wanted to put into it. And that's another trick that you can use. So along with the changing of thickness of the pencil, you can also have the changing of detail throughout the piece and the predetermining of how much detail you'll end up putting in the end. So in this one, after getting the actual sketch done and understanding all of the proportions and the planes of the face, I erased some areas so that I had the lighter pencil marks and then obviously more detail and focus in the eye area, less detail on the bridge of the nose. And yeah, that was just to create more of a focal point around that eye area with the detail and the darker marks. So you can use this process of predetermining detail and predetermining the center of interest when you sketch in pencil, and you can have that laid in from the beginning, ready to cover that with watercolor or oil paint. I do have one more secret pencil tip that I'll tell you, but let's tackle using watercolor in mixed media first. Alright, so watercolor. So one of the main things I've identified with mixed media is that people try and make everything all at once. So if you look at these three paintings, they're all created by mixing different mediums. And the first one is a heavier watercolor kind of piece, the middle one is more reliant on oil, and the last one is very heavy on the pencil and charcoal side, with actually no oil whatsoever. Now when you try and create a watercolor oil charcoal painting in equal amounts, you end up not knowing what to do at certain stages. So take for example this first one. I knew that most of it's going to be watercolor. So I want to get it to a very, very, very finished point with watercolor only, rendering out features accurately. And this will affect the level of detail, the level of color, and even the kind of watercolor marks I might be creating as I'm making it. It's only in the eye area and part of the hair area where there's some thick oil paint, but otherwise I wanted to keep it a mostly watercolor kind of piece, which meant low opacity and transparency being preserved even at the focal point. A huge mistake would have been for me to then add thick paint all over the background. That's what I mean when I say you want to know if it's mostly oil or watercolor or pencil. Oil is used to emphasize. Pencil shading shouldn't overpower the watercolor, and pencil can still be used to determine detail. With this piece here, I practically finished the entire drawing in charcoal, and then I just added a few splashes of watercolor here and there. Watercolor is an interesting accent here, and it's not there to completely steal the show. It's a mostly charcoal piece. The emphasis is on charcoal textures, and the watercolor doesn't take away from that. And of course, this last piece is the piece that you saw me create inside part 2 of this series, and it's mostly an oil painting. And the watercolor was kind of used for just supporting the background creation, adding some interesting texture here and there, and it wasn't meant to hold the entire piece together. And when I'm working with watercolor and oil in Rebelle, I either imagine that it's an acrylic underpainting or that I'm using solvents with my oil paint. Otherwise, I don't think you want to put oil on top of watercolor traditionally. And you can't really dilute oil with water, so I imagine that I'm just adding some kind of solvent. So again, traditional painters will focus on one medium as a leading medium and the other ones as support. That's probably one of the biggest reasons why your paintings look messy, is because they're everything, like this painting. Now back to watercolor. Okay, so now the tips for working with watercolors. Whenever you're working with watercolor, it's really helpful to start from light to dark. Unless, of course, you're just trying to get a splash in there and you need the saturation, then of course, you can just go full saturation. But if you're at the phase where the watercolor might be your initial areas of color, you want to start from light to dark and from desaturated to saturated. And it allows you to, like you're seeing here, just emphasize color relationships that you already like. And desaturated colors actually don't combat each other that much. So they work well together even if they accidentally overlap. And there's still a chance for you to fix an unwanted overlap because there is room to increase the opacity and saturation, which will help you create a different kind of color or cover up something. Another thing along with that tip is understanding your color harmonies. If you pick out a color harmony, then your colors are just bound to end up looking good together because it's a tested color pairing or matching that looks pleasing together. They're created to shortcut your way to successful color combos, especially if you keep the principle of contrasting saturated with desaturated. So that way it solves the problem of having muddy mixtures because you already have good color theory. You know that these colors are going to look good together in some way, shape, or form. Now, one of the biggest secrets that I've seen, and this actually changed the way I paint, and it's a tip that most professionals actually use, is that instead of taking risks on their final painting, they utilize the full craziness of watercolor only in the planning phase. So in my previous video, I spoke about planning your paintings out using color harmonies and things like that. Now, when you want that fun expression and random result that watercolor can give you, you can actually use watercolor to plan the paintings and force yourself to come up with more ideas and more color combos, as you see me doing for the current painting we're working on right now. And for these color combos, you can actually pick the one that you like the most. Now, what that does is that it forces more creativity from you. It allows more of that craziness to happen when you're painting with watercolor because it's a wet medium and can get pretty unpredictable. And it allows you to let go of the outcome because you know that this isn't the last version of the painting that you're doing, and it didn't take you that long to do either. There's going to be more, and potentially something better will occur. And then you know for certain that you're going with the best idea because you've pushed your brain to the limits. You've given the watercolor the chance to show you different combinations, and more than likely you've gotten out a few bad ideas. So now here's a twist. Traditional painters don't have an undo button on their mediums, and they face real consequences for their mistakes. So from this point going forward, I'm not allowed to use the undo button at all. Well, except for like if I'm trying to test a mark out on the side, then come on, you have to give that to me. Alright, so applying what I taught. I start with low opacity and low saturation, and I start building up on that like I said. And you'll notice in the skin, I start to introduce different colors. I love doing this in the watercolor stage because of how watercolor naturally blends into itself. So you can see that bleed occurring in the nose. And in the eye area, I'm going to add a few different colors too, which you see right there. And I'll lean into these colors later on in the oil stage. Now remember I told you I had a special pencil tip for you? Well, it's me coming back and reinforcing what I'm doing here with pencil. Now most people stop using pencil after they put any sort of paint down, but I like to come back with pencil because it's really easy to reinforce the drawing and get tiny details and still keep the tightness that you may be looking for by reintroducing pencil even at this stage instead of going with the kind of blurry lost edge look that would have happened if I didn't come back and reinforce the pencil drawing. Alright, so just a halfway recap on what we've covered so far so that you don't get lost. In the beginning, you want to use pencil, and pencil will help you establish the proportions, the areas of detail, and how detailed you want the finished product to be. And you can also determine where the center of interest is by playing around with the thickness of your pencil marks. Then with watercolor, you want to plan using small thumbnails to allow you to quickly have some expressive and iterative takes, which can help you maximize what you're doing with the watercolor, prevent ugly color mixtures, and allow just more freedom. After that, you begin painting from light to dark, from desaturated to saturated, and from transparent to opaque. And you finally use pencil to bring back some of that detail that you want to reestablish. Then we proceed to the oil painting. So for painting mixed media with oil, I want to break down a misconception I had about the bristle brushes that you may be facing right now. But before that, the first thing that you're going to do with your oils is that you're going to lean in to what's already established with the watercolor painting. So you can see in some areas, I increase saturation. In other areas, I'm just putting the same color down. And in other areas, I'm trying to go with more of a skin tone kind of color. Now, this is how you want to utilize that watercolor that was placed there. You want it to guide your color choices. Traditional painters use the oil as a correction and control layer and play off of the expression of the watercolor layer. Now that bristle brush tip, I realized that I was focusing too much on the new feature, and I needed to go back and use something that's designed for what I was trying to force the bristle brush to do. When you want to start painting in things like eyelashes, the truth is you need to abandon the bristle brush. Bristle brushes are great, but they're heavily focused on creating amazing textures. And when you need a fine line, you use a small round brush, and that's the same in reality. In reality, you wouldn't use a bristle brush for details. You'd be using a different kind of brush, maybe a synthetic liner, something like that. I also found that I enjoyed blending more with textured brushes and specifically if I need a smooth effect. Those bristle brushes still have amazing technology. The bristle brushes have their place, but every good traditional artist knows the strength of their tools and the effect that they desire from each tool. All of the other brushes in Rebelle aren't obsolete just because the bristle brushes exist now. They have their places. The third tip is that your watercolors, if planned correctly, can be highly saturated, and you can kind of have some of that peek through in your final paintings. Something that I mentioned in the other tutorial is that I like scraping away some paint and revealing the layer beneath. And if that's something that you enjoy too, you can incorporate that inside your work. So the final thing I do is I might try and plan some of the impasto out just to see what kind of combos I might like. I ended up going with this one, which I applied to the final painting. Okay, so first of all, I simplify the background a little bit with the oils. And as you can see, I use some diluted paint, which is okay because, you can use solvents in real life. Now, you'll notice it's really easy for me to start putting down these accent colors, these hue variations, because they're already in the watercolor mixture, and I'm leaning into that in the oils like I taught. And then I also go in with more detail in the eyes using the texture brushes instead of the bristle brushes, and then I take the bristle brushes everywhere else. And it's really simple for me to just go around the painting, looking at things I already like, enhancing them, and leaving some areas alone because everything was already established for me in the watercolor painting. And it should be this easy. It almost feels illegal or like cheating at this point. But as you can see, I mixed all three mediums there. So now what I want to do is take you through the process of repainting a painting I worked on a while ago. Now, as you can see, I followed the process. I put down a pencil kind of sketch. I put down watercolors and then oils, but this painting still didn't end up working out. And it's because as a beginner, it would have been better for me to establish the drawing and the details earlier on. And I also didn't understand composition at the time. And the painting was also a bit too chaotic. So here, as you can see, I'm establishing the composition, I'm establishing the drawing, the level of tightness or looseness that I want in some areas. Then I begin to form the color relationships. So I'm still thinking in terms of what I taught earlier. I add in the detail on top of the watercolor again. Then I go a little bit more crazy with the watercolor, but I'm still thinking about the relationship between the warms and the cools. So I make the lights cool and the shadows warm with the warm purple. Once that's established, I begin to use the oil paint, leaning in, adding detail inside the focal points, which are the eyes again and the face. And as I lean in, I'm still preserving the colors that were laid in. I go around touching up the background a bit more, still adding splashes because I love splashes. And I wasn't satisfied. I knew that the piece still felt a little bit chaotic to me, and this was a lesson in restraint. So I knew I had to come back and do something drastic, which was paint the entire background one solid color, at least at the top. And this created the necessary visual rest to make her have contrast and stand out. So let me know what you think. Did I manage to improve it, or do you like the version where the background is a little bit more chaotic? Overall, it does come down to personal opinion, and these are just some tips that have helped me, and hopefully they can help you if you feel stuck. So here are the tips, just for your quick reference. You can screenshot this. Otherwise, thanks for watching. I hope you found this helpful.